Hi everyone, in this video we are going to be talking about the evidence for the theory of evolution. And hopefully you'll remember that in science, a theory, like the theory of evolution, is not the same as the way people use it in everyday life. So it's not just saying like, oh, this is a guess. Instead, a theory is going to be a sort of unifying idea or explanation for a lot of different phenomena, and it's also going to have loads of evidence to back it up. So we're going to be exploring some of that evidence today. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is the fossil record. And I think when people think of fossils, the idea that comes to mind is, like a grand, complete skeleton of maybe something like a dinosaur in a museum or something like that. But the fossil record can include things that are way, way less grandiose than that. Fossil counts as anything that has been preserved in the Earth's crust that is sort of a trace or an imprint or a remnant of a plant or animal species that has lived in the past. And so this can be something like a bone or a complete skeleton, but it can also just be an imprint of a leaf or an imprint of a footprint. So really smaller scale things also count as part of the fossil record. And I mentioned in an earlier video that fossils were one clue that gave scientists the idea that the way species look now is not the same as how they looked in the past, that species that lived long ago, even if they were related to current species, looked different. And that's because the fossil record is the only way the fossil record is the only way that we know how organisms used to look, because they do give us that direct record of how things used to be. And because of this, we can see the relationship between species over time and how they've changed. So two examples that we have here. One is Glyptodon, which is an extinct sort of it's a species that was related to the armadillo that we know today, but it's way, way bigger. It lived in South America. You can see it sort of looks like a turtle or a tortoise. It's got that hard, bony shell. And these things were huge. They actually were the size of cars. Like this thing is as big as a car. So that's one example. And it's related to the armadillo, which is obviously much, much smaller and has a slightly different anatomy. And the other thing I have up here is the evolution of whales, which is one of the it's part of this class called cetaceans. And after fish had moved onto land, whales came about when those furry four-legged creatures move back into water. So we can see the sort of transition and family tree of how whales came to be. And you can see that it started from something that looked maybe more like a dog or a deer, and then eventually lost its limbs and fur and moved back into the water. So another sort of class or type of evidence that we have for evolution are homologous structures or homologies. And a homology is a similarity between species because they inherited that trait from a common ancestor. And we can have all different types of homologies. It can be something that's morphological, which has to do with the structure or the actual physiological makeup of an organism. It can be embryological, so the way that organisms develop in utero. It can be genetic or molecular, but essentially it's a trait that is shared between at least two species, and it's because their common ancestor had that trait and passed it on to both of them, or more than two. So the reason that this idea of homology counts as evidence for evolution is because if you consider these different types of vertebrates, so things like turtles and seals have flippers for swimming, whereas horses have feet for running, birds and bats have wings for flying, and humans have hands. And if the old idea was that all of these organisms were created independently and had no relationship to one another. So there would be no reason for the bird of a or the wing of a bird or a bat or the flipper of a seal to have any sort of commonality in terms of their underlying structure. But if we have the idea that all of these vertebrates at one point were sharing a single common ancestor to each member of the vertebrate family, then we could think that, well, maybe all of these limbs sort of they all inherited the floor plan for what a limb looks like from that common ancestor. And then we can make adaptations from there. So some of the bones are going to fuse or get skinnier or thicker. Some pieces are going to be elongated or shortened, but the underlying structure, the underlying floor plan is going to be the same because it came from that common ancestor. We can also look at things like embryology. All vertebrates sort of look the same at the beginning stages of development. So even humans have a tail and gills, which obviously we don't have once we're fully formed, but early on in development, because of the sort of common molecular pathways that all vertebrates share, everything kind of looks the same if you're on these early stages. And then finally, we can also look at genes or proteins, and a lot of similarities are seen there as well, where these sort of core genes or core proteins were preserved throughout evolution. And so you can see a lot of similar genetic sequences or amino acid sequences between different organisms like mice and humans and even worms and flies. So one thing to be careful about is, flip back to this other slide for a minute. We said a homologous structure is something that's similar between two species because they inherited that structure from a common ancestor. So that doesn't mean that any time that you see a similar looking structure, that it is a homology. So structures can also be the same or similar, but not have come from a common ancestor. And the word that we use for this is analogous structures. So analogous structures are similarities between species, but those species evolved separately or independently. So the similarity is not due to common ancestry. So if, an example here, if you look at the wings between a moth and a hummingbird, they both have these very delicate quick flapping wings, and they look quite similar, but the common ancestor of moths and hummingbirds did not have wings. So we can't say that they inherited their wings from a common ancestor. Rather, they both independently evolved wings. And this process where two independent lineages evolve the same trait is called convergent evolution. So the evolution of similar traits due to similar environmental challenges. Another example we can think of is that the tail fins of whales versus fish. So they look kind of similar. You know, they both have tail fins that flap in the water and help them swim. But fish, we just talked about how whales came back into the water after they'd been on land. So those two traits are not going to be from a common ancestor. So the tail fins of fish and whales are another example of analogous structures or convergent evolution. But being in the water, a tail fin helps you swim. So it's an example of how natural selection can lead to the same adaptation in distinct lineages. So this isn't analogous structures isn't an example of evolution, but it is an example of how natural selection can cause adaptation and changes. We also can think about vestigial structures. So vestigial structures are remnants of features. So they're sort of like degenerated versions of features that used to serve an important function in an ancestor organism, but are no longer useful or necessary to the organism that exists now. So doesn't do anything. Usually it's sort of gotten smaller over time. And it only makes sense if species change over time, right? There's no reason for an organism to have a useless trait unless that trait was once helpful in some way. So here are three examples. You can see tiny little vestigial hip bones in a whale, which they don't have hind legs, so there's no reason for them to have hip bones. Kiwi are birds that can't fly, but they still have little vestigial wings, and humans still have a tailbone, even though obviously we don't have tails anymore. And one thing that you're maybe noticing is that all of these structures are sort of small and I don't know, kind of sad looking in terms of their size, so the remnant of the tailbone or the remnant of the hip bone. And that's because there's a cost to keeping a structure around that doesn't do anything. If you have tissue that is not helping you out in any way, you still have to get the energy to maintain that tissue and give it energy and nutrients. And so if there's no benefit from it, a lot of times through natural selection, we'll sort of slowly reduce the size of that structure because there's a cost associated to keeping it around. And if it's not doing anything helpful, then it makes the most sense to stop paying that fee, if you will. Okay, and then finally, we can also think about experiments that have happened either naturally or through something humans have done to change the environment. So you guys read about or watched the video about the rock pocket mice and how changing the color of their environment caused them to evolve sort of a different prevalence in their fur color from lighter colored to darker colored. We've also talked in a previous video about peppered moths that changed from being more common in the peppered variety to being more common in the dark variety because of the Industrial Revolution. So those are both examples that we've talked about. We also just have directly chosen to domesticate specific plants and animals. So if you think about dog breeding or any sort of domestic animal breeding, birds, cats, et cetera, also plants. If you think about what we look for in crops that we eat, it's not necessarily the same things that were prevalent in the crop as it existed naturally. So if you look at an early banana or early types of corn, they look super different from the kind of banana and corn that we think of today. And then also by using things like pesticides and insecticides, we have encouraged the evolution of resistance to those types of things, as well as antibiotics in different species. Okay, so that covers the Evidence for Evolution video lecture, and I will see you all later.